Welcome back. We're joined live by Phil Coorey, political editor at the Australian Financial Review. Phil, thank you for your time.
Welcome.
Now, there's been it's been, I would say, fairly bipartisan, the approach of dealing with coronavirus, the virus itself, not the economic stimulus. We had Stephen Jones in here today saying that the Prime Minister was bungling it. Not too much reasoning why other than a lack of trust. What do you make of the government's response?
Well, I think it's been pretty good so far. You know, I mean, they've done everything they were accused of not doing on the bushfires. You know, they've listened to the experts. They've been ahead of the curve. You know, they've heeded the advice and they've acted before they've needed to act, and so sort of done everything they need to do. So I don't think you can flaw them on that front. I mean, governments around the world are doing similar things, so it's not like we're some outlier here. It seems to be a fairly, stock response, and Brendan Murphy, the Chief Medical Officer, is a fairly reasonable fellow by all accounts and knows what he's talking about, and they're doing what he's telling them to do. So I'm not hearing any complaints. It's quite the opposite to the fires, where the experts are saying we're not being listened to, and the PM was on holiday in Hawaii and all that sort of thing. So no, I don't see a problem with it.
And it does seem like we're fairly standard in a global sense. We're not the only ones hoarding toilet paper.
It is the dumbest thing. I mean, I did agree with the Prime Minister yesterday when he was out there trying to say don't panic without saying don't panic. But look, there are problems with global supply chains, clearly, but Dunny paper, as far as I know, Annalise, most of it's made here in Australia. So unless the coronavirus wipes out our pine plantations or our paper recycling, that's one thing you won't have to worry about is, cleaning yourself up afterwards. So, but if you want to panic, go and look at stuff that's made in China that you might need and, stuff like that. I think that there are serious concerns around other things, like medicines and, hygiene products and clothes and all those sort of things. But it's pretty.
The only thing I've stocked up on was Coke Zero.
Right, well,
that's an actual supply chain issue.
I haven't done anything. I'm useless. I'll just be drinking out of the toilet, I think, and eating the front lawn if it comes to it. But no, it's human nature, isn't it?
It is, and it's
silly.
But that's the problem, is that's how markets work too. Everyone's panicking, and then it causes other panic.
Well, it is. I mean, we're talking about a stimulus package now. I mean, I agree sort of with Ross Gittins today. One of the dangers of this is, and you can't. I mean, when the government comes out yesterday and says we may need to use these special rules to detain people and ban mass gatherings and stuff, and then an hour later they say don't panic. You can probably understand why people are a bit confused and so forth and go and buy the Dunny paper. But I suspect that the economic harm will be greater than that caused by the virus. You don't know. I mean, that's certainly a risk. So, but again, it's that old conundrum for governments. If they don't do everything they're told to do, and then it does turn out to be bad, they're in trouble. So you've got to sort of take the nuclear option on things like this.
Okay, so when we're talking about stimulus, this is a really interesting question because the government has been pointedly avoiding saying it needs stimulus. We have seen a change in tone the last few days.
Very much so. I mean, it was only this time last week the PM said we're quite very limited as to what we can do, and he essentially ruled out a stimulus thing, and then it was only the next day, I think it was on the Thursday last week, when they went to pandemic level, he said actually we will be looking at targeted, modest measures for affected sectors, and then yesterday he ramped up the rhetoric a bit more, and the backgrounding is now that it will be quite significant in terms of its size. So I guess, like everyone there, they're trying to keep up with this thing, and it's a sign that probably it's, the prognosis is a lot worse this week than it was last week. So we'll probably see the stimulus in the next week or so, I assume, after the RBA cut yesterday, and the Prime Minister listed the priorities yesterday. It was cash flow for business, keeping people in jobs until the crisis passes, and getting businesses to invest. So I think that's a big fat clue there for that business investment allowance, which the Treasurer mooted last year would be in the May budget. It was actually a Labor policy that Labor took to the last election, where you get a tax write-off or an accelerated depreciation for an investment. So I suspect there'll be some form of that, and we won't have to wait to the May budget to see it either.
So the interest rate you mentioned there, that's really interesting. All four banks passed on the full rate cut. That's the first time since 2015. Apparently, because they're spooked about the bank levy, that would just never happen, would it?
Look, the government, from what I can understand, didn't threaten them. I mean, Simon Benson's story today is sort of quite cautious the way it's written. There had been a bit of suggestion around about a week ago that the government might look at the levy, but the government has been quite emphatic in its public comments that we can respond to these crises without a tax or a levy. They wear that as a badge of honour. It's a virtue, if you like, because, as Josh Frydenberg said in Parliament yesterday, we've got the budget back to this position, therefore we're able to respond to these crises. So it would be a pretty big climb down to then go and whack a tax on someone or increase an existing tax. But having said that, there is, I think, this ongoing fear inside the banks that they could just turn up that levy any time they like.
Because that is, they are leaving themselves that option, aren't they? Because it's not a new tax. They're just going to tick up the one that's already
it's
there.
an increased tax. But from what I understand, the government's not considering it, and wasn't. But I think they allowed the banks to think.
Yeah.
They didn't disabuse them of the notion that it's an option. So it's it was allowed to. And the Prime Minister was very strong in his press conference yesterday morning, where he essentially said you'd be un-Australian if you didn't pass this on in full. When he
that was very strong language, saying that kind of do your duty.
So he put the fear up them, and they all lined up. It'll be interesting to see next time there's a rate cut how they probably won't pass any of it. How
many rate cuts have we got left?
They'll make it all back next time. So
just on that point, I mean, we really are running out of levers in that point.
Well, look, Annalise, I'm not an economist, but I couldn't see. I mean, other than the fact that all the central banks in the world had a coordinated strategy, we saw the US Federal Reserve went overnight with 0.5% to lower rates. I mean, I can't see. Most people say there's absolutely no stimulus value now in cutting rates in Australia. That stopped a couple of cuts ago because they're just so low. If anything, it just dampens consumer confidence because it sends a panic signal that the economy is tanking. And you've got to really feel sorry for the self-funded retirees. I mean, they cop it again in terms of investment. So, and I noticed Ian Henschke from Seniors Australia was out again today on deeming rates. So you're creating these sort of, I think you're sort of creating more problems than you're solving. I mean, people argue it was good because it needed to sort of do whatever for the value of the dollar, but. It's not like when you had high interest rates and cutting them actually had a meaningful effect on economic activity. I don't think this thing's going to do one bit.
Just finally, when we're talking about the budget, the big question is, are we going to have the surplus? We're seeing a bunch of Labor MPs walking around with the back in the black mugs that the government, that the Liberal Party was fundraising with last year.
Yeah.
Is this going to be a real political hit if they do lose the surplus?
Oh, it'll be a loss of face. I mean, the government was silly to bank it politically. I mean, given the taunting they gave Wayne Swan, when Swan gave that famous budget night speech tonight, I announced, the budget's back in surplus, and then it never materialised. I mean, they should have been more cautious last year because these things can always unravel. So, they banked it politically. They'll have to cop the flak for it. They never cut Labor any slack for driving the budget into surplus because of the GFC back in 2008. All the comments before the election about Labor came in last time and ran us into the red. Well, they forgot to mention why. So Labor's not going to cut them any slack this time, and they'll punish them over this too.
Do you think it'll translate to the electorate though?
Look, a little bit. It's too early to tell. I mean, one of the things, and people on both sides will tell you this, I mean, the coalition always gets the economic management points, right? Whether it's deserved or not, that's just that the perception is they're the economic managers. So, it doesn't hurt them from a political sense to have a bit of tension in the economy going into an election. People are probably more likely to want to stick with them than hand it to Labor. There's always this reluctance. Labor tends to, when they win power, things are pretty good economically. I mean, the last example being 2007, the GFC was still over the horizon, a year away. People have just become accustomed to things going pretty well, so they're sort of concerns stray away from the bread and butter issues, and it's much more favourable to Labor to win elections in those conditions. So I don't think if the economy bombs and it's really bad and there's mass unemployment and so forth, then no, it's not going to be good for the government at the time of an election. But if it's just hanging on the edge, I don't think they're too worried about the electoral consequences.
There you go, that's a good point. Phil Coorey from the Australian Financial Review, thank you for your time.
You're welcome.